Willpower has been called persistence. It's the knack of staying with something, the sustained effort necessary to induce absolute faith. Persistence is an essential factor in the procedure of transmuting the thoughts of what you'd like to have into their reality. Now, the basis of persistence is the power of will. Willpower and desire, when properly combined, as we've been shown down through the pages of history and are being shown on every side today, willpower and desire, when properly combined, make an irresistible pair. Men who accumulate great fortunes, for example, are sometimes known as cold-blooded, ruthless capitalists. But often they're misunderstood. What they have is willpower, which they mix with persistence and place back of their desires to ensure the attainment of their particular objectives. Henry Ford was generally misunderstood, thought to be ruthless and cold-blooded. And this misconception grew out of Ford's habit of following through in all of his plans with persistence. For example, I know the story that is reported to be absolutely true of when he wanted the first V8 engine cast, the block for a V8 engine cast. It had never been done before. As you know, he was the originator of the V8 engine. But he couldn't do it. But that's what he wanted, so he called in his top engineers and told them that's what he wanted. They said that can't be done. It's never been done, it's impossible, and so on. And he stopped their talking and said, go do it, that's what I'm paying you for. So they went, and in 3 months, after the most assiduous studying and research, they came back and told him again that his principle, whatever it involved, and I'm not a mechanic myself, but whatever it was, involved a process that was impossible, couldn't be done. It violated every known premise. So he gave them a talking to, and he says, now I don't want to hear from you again until you come back here with that V8 block. Go cast it, go do it. I don't care about any of these other things. Go do it anyway. And they came back with it. And the V8 engine was born. It was his habit of persistence regardless. And he didn't let the thoughts of other people, even though he only had a little bit of education himself, he wouldn't let a bunch of university-graduated engineers tell him that a thing couldn't be done. So they did it anyway. The majority of people are ready to throw their aims and purposes overboard and give up at the first sign of opposition or misfortune. Now, you know that's true, and so do I. But a few carry on despite all opposition until they get their goal. And these few are they have been the Fords, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the Edisons, and so on. There may be no heroic connotation to the word persistence, but the quality is to the character of man what carbon is to steel. And the building of whatever it is you really want for yourself and your family generally involves the application of willpower along with the other factors necessary. Now, unless you happen to be one out of the 2 out of every 100 people who already have a definite goal at which you're aiming and a definite plan for its attainment, you ought to think about this. Because just about 2 people out of every 100 definitely know what it is they want to do. Now, the starting point of all achievement or all willpower naturally is desire for something. It would be worthless without it. Now, you should really keep this constantly in mind. And the importance is that to desire something very much is right, and that's human. To not desire anything very much is animal-like, subhuman. Weak desires bring weak results, just as a small amount of fire makes a small amount of heat. And if you find yourself kind of short on persistence, this weakness may be remedied by building a stronger fire under your desires. You know, it seems that fortunes gravitate to men whose minds have been prepared to attract them, just as surely as water gravitates to the ocean. And if you find that you're a little weak in persistence, center your attention upon getting for yourself a definite purpose. Spasmodic or occasional effort to apply the rules of persistence and willpower won't help too much. To get results, you have to apply them all the time until they become a habit. And in no other way can you develop the necessary consciousness of achievement. It seems that poverty, by going over past history, is attracted to the person whose mind is favorable to it, as the opposite of poverty is attracted to him whose mind has been deliberately prepared to attract it, and through the same laws. Poverty consciousness, which was so widespread during the Depression, for example, will voluntarily seize the mind which is not occupied with achievement consciousness. And the poverty consciousness develops without conscious application of habits favorable to it. So the opposite must be created. You do it artificially. You actually create something that you really want. Persistence, willpower. If you've ever experienced a nightmare, you'll realize the value of persistence. You're lying in bed half awake, maybe with a feeling that you're about to smother. You're unable to turn over or to move a muscle. But even so, you realize that you must begin to regain control over your muscles. Has that ever happened to you? Well, through persistent effort of willpower, you finally manage to move the fingers of one hand. By continuing to move your fingers, you extend your control to the muscles of one arm until you can lift it. Then you gain control of the other arm in the same manner. You finally gain control over the muscles of one leg and then extend it to the other leg. And then with one supreme effort of will, you regain complete control over your muscular system and snap out of your nightmare. The trick has been turned step by step. And many people today find that it's necessary to snap out of their mental inertia through a similar procedure, moving slowly at first and then increasing their speed until they gain complete control over their will. But be persistent no matter how slowly you may at first have to move, because with persistence comes the thing you have your mind set on. Now, there's no substitute for persistence. It can't be supplanted by any other quality. Those who have cultivated the habit of persistence seem to enjoy insurance against failure, because no matter how many times they suffer defeat, they finally arrive up toward the top of the ladder.
Have you ever noticed that the longer you look at something you should be doing, the more difficult it seems to appear, and that the longer you put off something you should do, the more difficult it is to get started? A good deal of frustration and unhappiness could be avoided if people would just do what they know they should do. The great newspaper editor Arthur Brisbane once wrote, "Don't exaggerate your own importance, your own size, or your own miseries. You are an ant in a human anthill. Be a working ant, not a ridiculous insect pitying yourself." Strong language, maybe, but there's a lot of sense in it. A person carrying a heavy weight is all right as long as he keeps moving. The minute he stops, puts the weight on the ground, and sits down to rest, the weight seems to become heavier, the distance to be traveled greater, and the work just that much more unpleasant. Sometimes it must seem to everyone that things have piled up so high there's just no way of digging out. But there is. Pick the thing that's most important to do and simply begin doing it. Just by digging in, you'll feel better, and you'll find that it's not nearly as bad as you thought it would be. Keep at it, and before long the pile of things to do that seemed so overwhelming is behind you. Finished. What overwhelms us isn't the work itself, it's thinking how hard it's going to be. It's seeing it get larger every day. It's putting it off and hoping that somehow, through some miracle, it will disappear. The Chinese have a saying that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step, and that step accomplishes two things. First, it automatically shortens the distance we still have to travel. And secondly, and just as important, it makes us feel better, more hopeful. It strengthens our faith. And if a person will just keep putting one foot in front of the other, he'll be taken into new and exciting places, see new and interesting things, and think thoughts that never would have come to him if he'd remained at the starting point. And then, finally, the journey is finished. He wonders how or why he could ever have sat so long and worried and stewed about the time and trouble it would involve to do what he knew he should do. If you'll think back, you'll remember that you've always been happiest, most contented, after having finished a difficult project or faced up to a responsibility you were worried about. It's never as bad as you think it's going to be, and the joy that will come with its accomplishment makes it more than worthwhile. Work never killed anyone. It's worry that does the damage, and the worry would disappear if we just settle down and do the work. As Calvin Coolidge put it, all growth depends upon activity. There's no development, physically or intellectually, without effort. And effort means work. Work is not a curse. It is the prerogative of intelligence, the only means to manhood, and the measure of civilization. Mary Pickford used to say, "Don't look at the sudden loss of a habit or a way of life as the end of the road. See it instead as only a bend in the road that will open up all sorts of interesting possibilities and new experiences. After all, you've seen the scenery on the old road for so long, and you obviously no longer like it." The breaking of a long-held habit does seem like the end of the road at the time, the complete cessation of enjoyment. Suddenly dropping the habit so fills our minds with a desire for the old habitual way that for a while it seems there'll no longer be any peace or any sort of enjoyment. But that's not true. New habits form in a surprisingly short time, and a whole new world opens up to us. For those who have tried repeatedly to break a habit of some kind only to repeatedly fail, Mary Pickford said, "Falling is not failing unless you fail to get up." Most people who finally win the battle over a habit they've wanted to change have done so only after repeated failures, and it's the same with most things. So don't think of it as the end of the road, but as a bend in the road, and falling is not failing unless we fail to get up again. I remember in Arthur Miller's play, The Price, the father who lost everything during the stock market crash of 1929, and who for the rest of his life sat in a room in the attic of a home of a relative. That's failing. It seems some people lack the stamina, the energy to do it all over again or to make a new start. For them, it's just the end of the road, and they come to a full stop. Many lead such superficial lives, have so little depth of mind and spirit that the sudden loss of income or material things is too much for them, and they jump out a window or retreat into insanity. I remember hearing the story of the little boy who wanted to get over the backyard fence. He stood for a long time looking at the fence, and then slowly, with many falls and failures, he dragged a box to the fence. Again, after many attempts and falls, he managed to get to the top of the box, but he still couldn't reach the top of the fence. He set to work once again, this time getting a smaller box to place on top of the big box. Again, many falls, having to get back on his feet, much tugging and pushing and lifting and dropping, but he finally got it to the top of the big box, laboriously clambered to the top of it, grasped the top of the fence, and flopped over. Then he came back home. So if you've been trying to start in a new direction, you might do well to remember the advice of Mary Pickford. It isn't the end of the road, it's just a bend in the road. And falling isn't failing unless you don't get up again. Many years ago, I discovered Professor William James' wonderful little book on human reserves. In it, he says that everyone knows what it is to start a piece of work, either intellectual or physical, feeling stale. And everyone knows what it is to warm up to his work. The process of warming up is particularly striking in the phenomenon known as second wind. Now, usually, most people stop working at the first sign of fatigue. They say, "Boy, I'm bushed," and that's it for the day. As Dr. James put it, we have then walked, played, or worked enough, so therefore we desist. We simply quit. This sort of fatigue forms a kind of wall inside of which, as a rule, we work and live our lives. But if an unusual necessity forces us to press onward, a surprising thing occurs. The fatigue gets worse up to a certain critical point, then gradually, or suddenly, it passes away, and we find we're fresher than before. We've evidently tapped a level of new energy that had until then been masked by the fatigue barrier we usually obey. In fact, we may have discovered that we have third and fourth winds. This phenomenon occurs in mental activity as well as physical, and in some cases we may find, beyond the fatigue point, stores of energy that we never dreamed we possessed. Evidently, we stockpile reserves of energies we don't ordinarily use, and these reserves will go to work only when we demand enough of ourselves. Only a few exceptional persons make any serious demands of themselves. The great majority of us miss the far greater accomplishments of which we're capable, and the greater joy in living this would bring us because we quit and sit down, gasping at the first sign of fatigue. I remember one Sunday when I knew I had to write 10 radio shows all in one day. I got started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon I was so bushed I could hardly think. But I still had 5 shows to write, so I kept at it. All of a sudden I felt better and had more energy than I had previously. And by 1:30 the next morning, when I finally finished, I felt great. 16 and a half hours of steady mental work, and I was fresh as a daisy. But I felt like quitting after only 7 or 8 hours. The next time you get tired and you're doing something important, well, stay with it and see what happens. Each of us has a tremendous second wind, mental and physical. Passing through the fatigue barrier to draw upon our idle reserves can make the difference between existing and really living. Emerson said, "Vigor is contagious, and whatever makes us either think or feel strongly adds to our power and enlarges our field of action."
Dorothy Van Doren, the editor and author, in Words to Live By, chose some words of St. Francis of Assisi. She chose the words, "I would finish hoeing my garden." Now, these words were St. Francis' answer when someone asked him while working in his garden what he would do if he were suddenly to learn that he would die at sunset that day. He said, "I would finish hoeing my garden." And they seem to me, Dorothy Van Doren writes, they seem to me an answer to all the troubled young people these days who are beginning life in a world that appears to hold no security for them or for anyone, young or old. Why should they bother to go to college when the atom war is just around the corner, some people will say? Why should a young wife have a baby when the ceiling may collapse on its crib? Why should one paint a picture or write a song or begin a novel? We can't be sure of anything, these young people say, not now or next year or the year after that. Why should we try to make a life for ourselves, they ask. Why should we go to classes or take examinations or get married or look for an apartment or try for a job? Next spring or some spring too frighteningly near, it may all go, the life we've begun. Our world is in deadly peril. We've lost the promise of tomorrow, they'll say. Well, St. Francis put the answer in a simple metaphor. Go on hoeing your garden. The task is still here, the house to build, the book to write, the examination to prepare for. If the future looks dark, so did it on the morning before the first Christmas. And however dark it seems today, however dark it is, she writes, we shall meet life better if we have fulfilled the present to the best of our ability. Today is still ours, along with the obligation to live it to the full. And as St. Francis said, we must go on hoeing our garden.